We're going to begin Unit 5, which is taking a look at how we use our land and water resources. And the introductory lecture for this unit is Understanding Sustainability. So in this lecture, we'll discuss the principles of sustainability, take a close look at the tragedy of the commons, and finish up by coming to understand what an ecological footprint is. So to begin, we're going to look at the principles of sustainability here, and just to kind of redefine this was something that goes back to our first lecture of the course. But just a reminder, sustainability is the ability to meet our current needs and our future needs. So in its most simplest term, making sure we have enough resources for today and tomorrow. Basically, if we live every day like that, we should never run out of our resources, so they are sustained. But for something to be truly sustainable, there's three components, or three dimensions, as it says here according to this graphic. First of all, we need to have environmental sustainability, which I think makes sense because that's the focus of this course, right? We want to preserve our natural resources, reduce pollution, keep our ecosystems sustainable so they continue to function for us. But we also need, and just as much as environmental sustainability, we need social sustainability, meaning individuals should be able to live with their basic needs. When individuals do not have their basic needs, they become desperate and they tend to abuse the environment and sometimes even each other. So basic needs like healthcare, education, housing are very, very important to the overall theme and goal of sustainability. And then, of course, the third dimension that goes into this is economic sustainability. But you notice it focuses on long-term economic growth, not a get-rich-quick scheme or using resources inefficiently, like wasting them. So there's a lot of ethical use of our economies in this model of sustainability. And as we've discussed before, when we consider the environment and the society and our economy as equal components that are interdependent on one another, we can hit that goal of being sustainable. So the key principles, of course, as we mentioned, are interdependence, right? We have to recognize that, yeah, we want to protect the environment, but just as much so we want to protect people and a functioning economy, which is how we use those environmental resources. We have to look at the long-term view, in particular with economics, right? We want to understand what are the long-term consequences of how we use our resources now and how we allocate them to society. We have to accept that we live on a finite planet. So this is resource finitude, I believe is how we want to pronounce that. But basically that we have a limited amount of resources, and even those that are regenerative, like the water cycle, we can abuse them and cause them to be unbalanced. And then, of course, the systems approach, which is basically looking at our world as an ecosystem, right? So we understand that everything's linked together, and so any solutions or policy we come up with, we want to make sure it's not fragmented, but really encompasses all three dimensions of sustainability. So one way that sustainability works is to understand that natural resources are really like natural capital. But natural capital doesn't include just resources like fine earth metals or water, but also the ecosystem services we've talked about back in Unit 3. And so, like, unlike traditional economics, we want to seek and value natural capital so that we don't deplete it. And this graphic might be really good for our visual people and also just understanding the whole concept in terms of something we might understand a little bit more concretely. And we're first going to look at a financial example. Now this is very hypothetical. Let's just assume that we have $1 million deposited into our bank account, and that represents our capital, right? So that would be wonderful to have that in the bank. So cool, that's a nice start. Now, let's just say we have an amazing bank account. Maybe it's a CD or something that's giving us 10% interest, which is unheard of in these days, but let's just assume we get 10% interest on that $100 million. That means every year we have $100,000 interest added each year. Let's assume we don't have any job or anything and we just want to live off that $1 million capital that we have invested in our bank. Well, if we spend $100,000 each year, well, that's the definition of having a sustainable financial situation, right? If you only spend $100,000 each year, then you'll be left over with $1 million at the end of the year. And guess what? Next year, you'll have another $100,000 and it'll keep regenerating itself. If we spend less than that, then our capital would grow and in theory would actually make more. If we overspent, if we broke our budget and say spent $200,000, well, now after 8 years, just 8 years, we are now at a balance of zero. So we used our money unsustainably. Well, ecosystems are very similar in this regard. So let's look at an ecological example. Let's say the natural capital we're taking a look at is the population of tuna in the wild, right? So we have a large population of tuna present on the planet. The natural interest is the number of fish that are added each year, right, through reproduction. So the tuna is an R-selected species. They'll have lots of offspring, and so there's a certain number added to the population. And understanding that there is a carrying capacity, as long as we take only a certain section of the overproduction of the population, well, then that's sustainable. If we take far less, then the population will grow. If we take too many, now the population crashes, right? So this is known as overfishing. So when we look at resource use, it's a good way to look at it in terms of natural capital, right? If you have money in the bank, you want to protect it and sustain it so you don't run out. And so wouldn't it be nice if we viewed all our natural resources, whether they be tuna or trees or anything that nature provides to us, as capital in the bank, that we want to protect it and not overuse it. One of the concepts that's important to sustainable use is sustainable yield. So we saw in that previous graphic there, we saw that if we are using tuna, catching tuna at a sustainable yield, then the population won't decline. So how do scientists determine what sustainable yield is? Well, one of the key concepts is maximum sustainable yield, MSY as it's shortened here. And that's the theoretical largest harvest that can be taken from the resource over and over again. And it has a lot to do with population growth. In fact, the logistic growth curve that we studied going back to Unit 3, right? So here we can see population will start to grow exponentially and then level off as it hits that carrying capacity, right? The population size. And this is where the population is growing kind of slowly, right? Because the environment is putting pressure on the population. It can't grow any faster. Well, what resource scientists, whether it be fishery scientists or forestry scientists, what they want to do is figure out, well, what's this point? This is the point at which the population is growing the fastest. And if we harvest the population down to this point, in theory, it should rebound and grow back the quickest. And so this is what determines the maximum sustainable yield. So basically this point of harvesting, or effort, we could say, we're calling this fishing effort, that's the maximum amount of fish we can take without depleting the resource, right? So this is why it's called the zone of optimal effort, right? So we have an optimal yield. We're catching a lot of fish every single year we go fishing. If we underutilize, if we put too little effort in, well, then we're underutilizing the resource. We're not harming the resource, but we're not getting the economic benefit out of it that we could potentially get. So that's considered to be underutilization. Now, if we take too many fish, well, this is overfishing, and we're overutilizing the resource. We're taking too many, and the population in the future will crash because we've harvested down to the point where now the population is too slow to recover. The idea is to only harvest down to the point of fastest growth, sometimes also referred to as the full biotic potential of the population, where it can reproduce the fastest and recover the fastest. Now that's all fine and good, but there is a big challenge to sustainability, and it's known as the tragedy of the commons. And this is a term that was come up with years ago to describe how individual users tend to prioritize their own selfish interest over the common good. It is unfortunately a human behavior that needs to be overcome. The term tragedy of the commons is basically saying that whenever we have a common resource, if individuals exploit it or overexploit it, I say so, through overuse, then it crashes and it's a tragedy. So it was described initially as the common grazing area that farmers would use. So they would put their sheep or cattle on a pasture land that was shared. It was a common open use resource. And so what we can see here initially in our diagram is that basically if we were using it below the carrying capacity of the land, if we were just putting the right amount of sheep on there, well, there would always be green grass for the sheep to graze on, and we'd have healthy sheep and a good product, and everybody would benefit. So this is a sustainable approach. You'll notice in the second picture the grass is starting to look a little weathered, and we have more sheep on there. And the idea here is, well, if one or more users increase their use of the commons, they will initially benefit, but at the cost of the resource being degraded, which then that cost of the pasture land not being as healthy is incurred by all users, not just those that put the extra sheep on there. Oftentimes what individuals will do, rather than take fewer sheep off the pasture, they will get angry or respond by putting more sheep on there, and that further degrades the land. And now we have the tragedy. The common resource was the healthy pasture land. The tragedy was overexploiting it, and now it's unable to support the grazing of sheep in the future. And so this is known as the tragedy of the commons. This video will describe it and give a few other examples for you.
The commons describes a situation where a shared resource is exploited because of individual self-interest and damages overall social welfare. The air we breathe and the water we drink are just two examples of what we call commons. Tragedy of the commons is an important phenomenon with moral dimensions. Garrett Hardin, who coined the term, used the example of a pasture that all shepherds can access. Because the shepherds are all selfishly motivated to graze their animals as much as possible for short-term gain, the pasture is quickly overgrazed and depleted. The overall community suffers. Some people believe that converting shared public resources into private property motivates owners to preserve those resources for society. Others believe that government regulation is a better solution. Both strategies have limitations. There are no easy fixes to the tragedy of the commons, but pro-social behavior can help. For example, Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize for studying how communities often voluntarily work together to prevent overconsumption and to create a stable, common pool of resources. Whatever the strategy, most philosophers agree that we have a moral duty to overcome this tragic phenomenon and to preserve shared resources for the common good.
So you'll notice in that video that there's three potential solutions to the tragedy of the commons. One is to privatize the resource, make it private so that people, if they own the resource, well, then they're going to want to take care of it more. Or it could be to have government regulations to limit access to the resource. And the third one was, well, having society work together. And this goes back to what we talked about, one of the principles of society or of sustainability. If everyone feels they're getting their needs met, they're less likely to exploit resources. And so they will more often work for the common good. It's typical when people feel they aren't getting what they need, or if they're not satisfied with their needs being met, and they act with selfishness, that's where we end up having this tragedy of the commons. Let's now discuss ecological footprints. So ecological footprints are very interesting. It's a measure of how much land your lifestyle requires. And so it can basically be used as an index to, like, for individuals. Like, you in the lab, you're going to calculate your own personal ecological footprint, but you can also apply this to towns, states, even countries. So they can be applied to many different levels. And an ecological footprint, is a comprehensive measure, meaning that it includes many different variables in it. First of all, carbon footprint, and this is often the largest component of your ecological footprint. This is the amount of land that would need to be present to absorb all the carbon dioxide emissions you put out into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuel. So this is kind of like tied to how much you drive your car, what kind of car you drive, how much electricity you use, and how your electricity is generated, right? So if you burn more fossil fuels, you'll put more CO2 into the atmosphere. That would require a larger forest to absorb or sequester that CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's known as your carbon footprint. The second component is known as the cropland, grazing, and fishing grounds. This basically is the amount of area needed to provide you food, whether it be vegetables, meat, or fish. And so this then, as you study it and learn a little bit more about this, you'll learn that this is why we try to advocate for a more vegetable-based diet, plant-based diet, because it uses up less land. The 10% rule tells us that 90% of the energy that's stored in plants will be wasted as sheep or cows feed on it, right? So therefore, a meat-based diet requires a lot more land than a plant-based diet. A forest blueprint is an area of forest required to provide products that you use, whether it be lumber, paper, etc. Built up land is the physical space that you require. How big is your house? How many roads do you require? How many factories are needed to provide all the goods that you purchase and use during the year? And finally, your water use is basically how much water you use for your home use, for electricity generation, for the products you buy, and of course how that affects ecosystems. Later on in the course, we'll also calculate, in addition to our ecological footprint, we will calculate a water footprint to take a closer look at this. We also will take a close look at our food print later on, which is looking at how much land we need for the types of foods that we eat. Now, closely tied to ecological footprint is Earth's biocapacity, which is Earth's ability to regenerate resources and assimilate or deal with the waste that we generate. And so if an individual, region, or country has a higher biocapacity than its ecological footprint, we say that there is an ecological reserve or surplus. So this would be a good situation. This would be acting sustainably, right? Earth is able to provide us more than we use, so we won't use those resources excessively. An individual, region, or country would have an ecological deficit if our ecological footprint exceeds the biocapacity, meaning we are using resources faster than Earth can provide them to us. And currently, a majority of countries and areas are in an ecological deficit. The concept of global overshoot is basically how much we are exceeding biocapacity. And so we currently are in a state of ecological overshoot, right? Our demand exceeds Earth regenerative capacity, meaning our ecological footprint, our demands on ecosystems are higher than what Earth can possibly provide us. So if we add it all up, we're estimating that we need close to 2 Earths to provide us for what we are actually using. So what that means is every year we are using future resources. We're not behaving sustainably. And so there's an interesting term that describes this. It's called Earth Overshoot Day. This is the date when humanity has used up nature's budget for the entire year. Meaning, let's just assume on January 1st that nature provides us all the resources we get to use through December 31st. Well, if we use them sustainably, we'll have resources, food, water, etc. for the entire year. If we use them too quickly or unsustainably, well, then we might run out of them, say, in November and in October, which means after that date, we're using next year's resources. And so this concept of Earth's overshoot day is calculated by taking whatever the biocapacity is, whether it be for the whole world, and we're going to look at the world biocapacity and overshoot day. We take that biocapacity and divide it by the ecological footprint. That's basically the ratio of how we're using resources, and multiply it by 365 days. And then from January 1st, you can see when you'd run out. And so this graphic here will show you that, well, back in 1971, our Earth Overshoot Day was December 29th. So that was pretty good. We were using we were using things sustainably. But you will notice as we go through the decades, in the 1980, we were using our resources, Earth Overshoot Day, and we're using all our resources by November. Then in the 90s, it was October. In the year 2000, September. In 2010, we're in August. And currently in the year 2025, Earth's Overshoot Day is July 24th. This means in the year 2025, July 24th is when we used up the resources we were supposed to use for the entirety of 2025. So that means currently we are already using resources from next year. And so we continue, if we look at this back at our financial example, we continue to use our resources and incur ecological debt. If we look at the biocapacity, this map will show you the biocapacity of different countries throughout the earth. So you can see the United States, Canada, Brazil, Russia, China, huge total biocapacity. This is because of the amount of land available and the resources, forests, water, etc. This here is looking at the total ecological footprint. And you'll see, well, United States, China, India, very large ecological footprint, has to do with very large populations. So you'll notice there's definitely a correlation between those countries that are developed and less developed. This here will tell us whether or not we have an ecological deficit or an ecological reserve. The countries in green have a high biocapacity, or at least I should say their ecological footprint is less than their biocapacity, so they're in the green. Countries that are in the red, well, those countries are using resources faster than their biocapacity, and so they are said to be an ecological deficit. So the United States is in the red. We use our resources faster than our country can provide it. You go to Canada. Canada had a large biocapacity and a fairly large ecological footprint, but because of the fact that there's a smaller population and more natural resources available, even though they have a high total ecological footprint, well, they live in a reserve because their population is so low. So you can see there how human population comes into this and protecting resources and so forth. This is looking at the world condition in the year 2025, and this graph here is very interesting. This is showing the global hectares of land that every person uses, right? And so what we have graphed here is the red is the ecological footprint, and we can see that is graphed here. And then the green line is the biocapacity. So we can see over time biocapacity has steadily been going down. And here's that notable year of 1970. That is a little after 1970. That is where our ecological footprint exceeded Earth's biocapacity, and we've been living in the red since that. And so when we look currently in the year 2022, the biocapacity per person is like Earth can support 1.5, or each person can get 1.5 hectares of biocapacity from the Earth. But currently, every person on the planet is living and using 2.7 global hectares. So that means we have a deficit of 1.2 global hectares per person on our planet. And when you take a look at the overall population approaching 8 billion, that is a problem. We are not living sustainably. This video here will help to describe the overall concept of ecological footprint and review a lot of the concepts we looked at in this lecture.
Economic growth is the goal of nearly every government in the world. In its simplest terms, growth means that more money is spent in an economy every year. But there is a problem with this. The reality is that over the past 30 years in the developed world, wages have not grown quickly enough for people to have more money to spend. Because of this, governments have not been able to raise enough taxes to support greater levels of spending. This should have caused the economy to stop growing, but it didn't. Instead, people, companies, and governments have kept on spending by borrowing money from all over the world and relying on high-risk investments. As a result, the economy has continued to grow, but it has been based on ever-increasing levels of debt. The most common measure for the wealth and development of a country is gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the total value of everything we make and everything we spend. For households, this could be buying a television, a computer, food and clothes. And for companies, this means buying office materials, resources such as steel for production, energy, and services including telephones and deliveries. And for governments, they have to run hospitals and schools, provide security and a clean environment. Their job is to make sure that the basic needs of society are met. In today's world, the higher the GDP, the greater the wealth of the nation.
The way our economies work now is we measure progress in terms of GDP, which really just measures the financial flows in the economy. It doesn't measure all the other important things, like the way we use resources.
Everybody talks about growth, but how can you have continued growth on a finite planet? Finite planets basically force you to start rethinking the way we're going. The way we are going at the moment is to use more and more materials and energy and resources and water and everything else.
The problem with GDP is that it doesn't include the value of important things such as the free services that nature gives us. Clean air and water, pollination of plants and crops, wild animals, or voluntary work, looking after elderly people. Another problem with GDP is that it does not include the costs to society of environmental pollution from the production of chemicals, energy and materials, or the dumping of waste and the overuse of resources.
The GDP model was created at a time when economists didn't know the limits of nature's ability to support human activity. But we're now pushing up against those natural limits. GDP is short-sighted because it counts the depletion and degradation of our natural wealth as if it were economic gain. But it is not a gain, it's actually a loss. If a country were to cut down all its forests, GDP would grow because GDP only counts the timber value of the forest once they're cut and sold at market. Our standing forests have immense value, protecting wildlife and a rich biodiversity, providing clean water, preserving soils, preventing landslides, minimizing carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and so much more. But because these values to society are invisible within GDP, it's not a surprise that the world has accumulated a massive ecological debt that doesn't appear in any country's national accounts. There are so many examples of this absurdity. The more fossil fuels we burn, the more greenhouse gases we emit. Then the more GDP grows, and therefore, according to conventional economic dogma, the better off we are supposed to be.
I come from a metal trading background, and it's quite interesting to look at how the market works, because there is a physical market with trade of physical metal that is handled. But beside there is a metal market called paper metal. It is possible for a bank, and I do know some examples, to sell forward paper gold for supply later much more than there exists on this planet. What it leads to is financial bubbles. We sell things that don't exist. Now, this has been known to happen in gold and silver, but it is not limited to that. The same thing has happened in lead, in nickel, in aluminium, in grain, in coffee. And this distorts the markets, it corrupts the price mechanisms, and it makes the markets less efficient.
Prices are meant to be a good signal for us what to do and what not to do. At present, there is no price on destroying nature. So if someone has a mine and just digging into it and taking out what is there, he does not pay for destruction that he causes.
When it comes to our use of natural resources, it seems that nobody is paying attention. This is a problem because we are using up natural resources faster than they can regenerate themselves. So we are building up an environmental debt. It is now clear just how unsustainable our use of resources has become. And to make matters worse, we continue to increase our resource use as every year the global population increases by about 70 million people. The United Nations has concluded that if current population and consumption trends continue, by the 2030s, we will need the equivalent of 2 planets to support us.
All right, a little bit of AP practice here. Let's start out with the multiple choice question. So which of the following best illustrates the concept of the tragedy of the commons? You can pause the video and take a look and see what you think is the best answer. Okay, the correct answer here is depletion of an aquifer by regional farmers, right? So we're seeing clear a tragedy, which is the depletion of the aquifer. And the aquifer is a common and shared resource, right? The groundwater that all the regional farmers are tapping into. Here is the FRQ. I'll let you go ahead and pause the video and attempt to answer this question. Okay, so this FRQ is looking at understanding resource use and sustainability. So part A is describe what makes a resource renewable or non-renewable, and then give a specific example of each. So 1 point for your description of either renewable or non-renewable. So we can see a renewable resource is normally replenished by natural processes. It's not depleted by moderate use. And examples of that could include solar energy, trees, fish, anything that naturally replenishes itself. Non-renewable resources are not replenished by natural processes within a useful timescale, right? So yeah, petroleum can be reformed, but it takes millions of years to do so, right? So that's not within a useful timescale. And so examples include fossil fuels, metals, stone. Okay, so all right. Part B, describe and compare total resource use per capita in developed and developing countries. So 1 point for the comparison, and basically 1 point for saying that the total resource use is much greater in developed countries, right? And then the description, well, you could take any of these, any of the 1 point for each of the descriptions, right? So describing what's going on in the developed, higher gross national product, right? Lower per capita gross national product in developing countries. So I'll let you kind of read through here. You can tell there's a lot of things that you can could have said for that question. Now C, what is meant by sustainable resource use? Give an example. Well, 1 point for the definition. The use of a resource at a rate that does not reduce its availability or its ability to be replenished on a long-term basis, right? So something along those lines. You could have also said what you wrote down for notes here as well. Now, examples of sustainability, 2 points. So basically what you want to do is give an example and then explain how you can use it. 1 point for how it's used sustainably and elaborating on that. So I did an example here of soil. We just recently had a nice lab about that, right? So we use soil for the regeneration of farming techniques, and of course we want to use it sustainably with process of contour plowing, terracing, reduced tillage. And then if you explain like, oh, reduced tillage is where you don't plow the field, that preserves soil. That would have gotten you the 2 points there. All right, so that wraps up this lecture, and I hope you have a good understanding of sustainability now.